In this video, I'm going to show you the steps that I go through to build a bike from the frame up. I'm not going to go into detailed instruction of every single step, but rather show you the whole process. This is something that you'll do when buying just a frame and adding your components, or maybe you're swapping out a frame, or as in this case, I bought a new bike that's pretty much disassembled. It's just the frame and I'm going to put on all the components. So here is the frame. And the first thing that you would do is install the dropper post cable. Now this particular frame has a couple things already installed. It does have the cable run through the frame. It also has the bottom bracket and the cranks installed. If that were not the case, the first thing that I would do is run the dropper post cable through the frame, because most of the time you've got to have the bottom bracket removed so that you can fish that cable up through the bottom bracket shell and then up through the seat tube. Now I have pushed it down inside here a little bit because the next step is to go ahead and put the seat post in, and I'm not really going to align everything up or anything like that. I just want to put the seat post in so I can clamp the frame into the work stand and then begin the build. So I've got the seat post installed and now I can just clamp it into my work stand. There we go. Now that the cable is installed, I've got it in the work stand. The next thing that you would do is you would install the bottom bracket. So this is a threaded bottom bracket, so I would screw those in. And if you've never done this before, the right bottom bracket shell is a reverse thread. The left is a normal thread if it's a threaded bottom bracket. If it's a press fit, you need a tool to press those in. Then you would install the cranks. The next thing that we're going to do is install the fork. So to install the fork, the first thing that you want to do is put in the head cups. Now this frame actually has the head cups already installed, which is nice. I've gotten some that haven't had that, but you would go ahead and press in the head cups, and then we're going to install the fork. Now the fork is not cut yet, so we want to install it, get our measurement, and then cut the steer tube. And the way that I do that is that I drop the bearing on the fork, so the large bearing goes on, the flatter part facing down, and then I'm going to install it into the bike, and then I'm going to drop in the other bearing. This bearing goes on top. Then I'm going to put on the top cap, and it's got this little wedge inside. Sometimes that's separate. It fell out there. And there's an O-ring inside there for a seal, and sometimes it's hard to slide that down. Now what I do is I will typically put on at least 4 spacers to begin with. I'd rather cut the fork and then decide that I need less spacers than need to add more. So I'm going to drop on 2 spacers, I'm going to drop on the stem, and then I'm going to drop on 2 more. And just to be safe, I'll do a total of 5. So what I'll probably do when I first run this bike is I'll probably put 2 or 3 below the stem and the remaining above the stem. That way I don't cut the fork too short to begin with. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to tighten the stem just a little bit to hold it onto the bike so that I can do a measurement. So I've got to hold the fork up as I do this, and then just tighten down the stem. Obviously we're not having to line up the stem because we're just going to have to take everything back off to cut the fork. So cutting the steer tube is your next step. I still have the bubble wrap on the fork just to protect it while I'm doing this. I've learned that from experience. So let's tighten that down. I'm going to back it out just to press everything together, make sure it's really secure in there as I pop bubble wrap, and then I'll tighten it, and then I'm going to take a measurement. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a razor blade and just put a little mark on the steer tube, and that will give me a reference point of where to cut. We're going to cut below that. We're going to cut maybe 3 or 4 millimeters below that line. So now I've got a line, and the reason I cut below it is because we're going to install this cap, and you'll see that there's a lip right there, and this has got to be at the top of the fork, and you've got to be able to have a little bit of space, a little gap between the top of this cap and this top cap, and you'll see what I mean when I do this, but that's why we're going to cut probably, I'd say about 4 millimeters below that line. Take everything back off, drop the fork out. So I've got the fork installed into the cutting guide, and then I've got the cutting guide in a bench vise. Like I said, this is not going to be a step-by-step tutorial. but basically I'm just going to use a hacksaw, and I've got my mark there, so I verified 3 times that I'm cutting about 3 to 4 millimeters below my mark, and so I'm going to do that with the hacksaw. All right, steerer tube is cut. There's my extra piece. You can use a tube cutter on an alloy steerer tube, but if your steerer tube is carbon, you have to use a hacksaw and a cutting guide. Do not try to use a tube cutter, it will destroy it. So yeah, now I'm just going to take a file and I'm going to file off the edge there, and then I'm going to install the fork into the bike. I'm going to install this little silver cap. It just kind of goes on there, and then you tighten it down with a 6mm Allen wrench. And then that's what the top cap threads into. Sometimes you really got to hold this with your fingers. Sometimes you got to use like a pair of pliers or something to hold it down, and then get this thing all the way tightened. One tip with this cap is you can tighten it just so it's kind of hard to push down in there, and then you can tap it down in there with a soft mallet, and that gives it some friction, and then finish it up with that 6mm Allen wrench to get it pretty tight. On some bikes, I install my homemade chainstay protector, which I have a YouTube video on how to do that. It's just an inner tube wrapped around there. Don't do it on every bike now, but I do it on some, and I'm going to do it on this one because this bike is designed for riding in rugged terrain. All right, my next step is to install the handlebars. So handlebars are installed, and you don't have to worry about the tilt. You just want to eyeball it, get it about where you think it'll be, because we can't adjust everything until the bike's completely assembled and on the ground. Then you can adjust the handlebar, you know, tilting back and forth, and then the stem and all that. So we're just getting everything on the bike and snug. The next step is going to be to install your shifters, your brakes. So these are already on. After you get those installed, you're going to put on the grips. Again, you don't have to worry about the angle, that they're perfect. You just want to make sure they're on the bike, and then get them about where you think they're going to be, and we'll get those lined up with the bike on the ground later. Next, we're going to get the wheels set up, and the order that I do this is I install the tires, and then I install the rear cassette, and then I install the rotors. Now these came already set up, which is again really nice, but again, do that order: tires, cassette, and then the rotors. The next step that I do is install the front derailleur and the rear derailleur. In this case, it's only a rear derailleur. So just put a little grease on the threads and install that. And then we're going to move to installing the cables inside of the frame, to include putting on the rear brake caliper. I'm going to start with the shifter cable. I usually start from the back. I find that most bikes, it's easier to install the cables from the back, but you can start from the front if you want for the shifter cable. Most modern bikes today are really easy to run cables through a frame. Like you just push it through, it pops out one hole, and then like this bike, there's going to be, there are actually 2 separate places where I run. So I run the cable through the seat stay, and then another one goes through the actual down tube. Now I said it's easy to start from the back, but this bike, I think I might need to start this one from the front. It's not pushing out the other side. Oh, never mind. It was hitting the frame. That was super easy. Okay, take that back. All right, so that's a piece of cake. And then this one, I'm gonna feed it back through. So I'm gonna put it back in this hole here, and it will go through the frame and come out a hole at the top of the top tube. Now remember, I put well, it was already installed, but you would put the dropper post cable in one of the first things you do, because you want to do it definitely before you install the cranks. But it was already installed. All right, that thing popped right out the top, and that was a piece of cake. So that's my shifter cable. And just a side note here is you want to run cables through the frame before you put the cable ferrules on the top. So that little plastic piece, you run the cables through, and then we're going to put those on after we cut the cables. I'm going to go ahead and cut the shifter cable and install the shifter cable and get that set up before I install the rear brake hose. So I pushed it up from the back. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get a length that I feel comfortable with. And you know, you don't want to do too much. So the shifter cable, what I do is I turn the bars, and I make sure the bars can turn as much as they need to without having too much excess cable. If you get too much excess, there's going to be a sharper bend up at the shifter, and that can kind of wear on the cable. So you know, you want enough slack so that it's not, you know, touching the frame. It's just an art, right? There's no science to this. So I feel good about that length. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut it at the back. Same thing at the back at the rear derailleur. You wanna have the appropriate loop. This derailleur setup, there's not much loop in the cable at all. Now remember, we have not pushed the inner wire through yet. You wanna get the cable set up before you push that through. So I'm gonna do a loop about like that, and then I'm just gonna cut the cable. All right, now we're going to put on the little plastic ferrules on the end. Here's just a little tip. Any place where I've cut a cable, I take a small little nail and just make sure that plastic sheathing inside is opened up, and that will allow the cable to come through easier. So this, you know, again, just a small little nail, just open up that hole. Okay, and then we're going to push the inner wire through after we put on our cable ferrule. Cable ferrule there. And another cable ferrule up here. And now we're ready to push the inner wire through. I put some light lube on an inner wire. People do it differently. I use Triflow, just a little light lube. Again, there's different opinions out there on if you should put anything at all. But I like to do just really, really light lube. So I'm just gonna feed the inner wire through. It's gonna come out the back. And then we'll just get the rear derailleur set up. I'm not gonna do anything with it yet. I'm gonna put the rear brake on first so we can get the rear wheel installed, and then we'll set up the rear derailleur. Actually, before I put on the rear brake, I'm gonna go ahead and install the front brake caliper just to keep that from dangling out of the way. You will have to cut the lines if it's a brand new set of, you know, brakes that's never been, you know, the lines have never been cut, which is the way it is here. So I'm gonna go ahead and put on this front brake caliper. So I've got the front brake caliper installed. Just another tip here for you. A brand new bolt is going to have thread lock on it, so it kind of feels like you're cross threading because it's so hard to turn, but just make sure that's going in straight, but you will have some resistance because of that thread lock. All right, now we're going to do the rear brake caliper. I'm going to go ahead and push the rear brake hose up through the frame before I install the rear brake caliper. It just makes it a little easier. So I'm going to pull this little cap off, and then I'm going to push this up through the frame. So that popped out real easily. I'm just going to push it up through the frame just like I did the shifter cable. Like I said, most modern bikes today have channels inside the frame, which makes this so much easier. Niner, this particular brand, have done such a great job with this lately on their bikes. It's just a piece of cake. So mounting the rear brake caliper, now that the hose is pushed up through the frame. I don't do these bolts all the way tight. So what I do is I tighten them all the way down, and then I back it out just a little bit so they'll move around when I put the rear wheel on, because I haven't not aligned the brakes yet. Same with the front. So all the way down, just back it out, maybe like half a turn. Good little movement in that caliper. So yeah, you want it to move side to side so we can put the rear wheel in for the first time and not have that bind up. Back up at the front of the bike, I'm gonna go ahead and measure and cut the rear brake and the front brake. Again, this is not gonna be a tutorial on how to do this. I just wanna show kind of the steps that I go through. I have videos on my YouTube channel on how to do this. But for the rear brake, I'm gonna probably do something about like that. Like I said, with the shifter, I wanna be able to turn the bars, not have it bind up, but I don't want too much flopping around, so maybe even just a little bit shorter. And then same thing for the front. It's already installed, so I've got to remove it, cut it, and then I will have to bleed the brakes. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut the cables. Back up at the front of the bike, I've cut the rear brake hose. I've got to install a new hose insert. I've got this tool to do this, which makes it so much easier, but if you don't have the tool, you have to use a bench vise with those little yellow blocks, and you just tap it in with a hammer. But this tool will press it in, and it makes it so much easier. Now I can put the rear brake hose into the lever. Okay, so now that I've got the brakes done, I'm gonna put the rear wheel in, and I'm gonna go ahead and adjust the derailleur. I like to adjust it before I put the cable into the derailleur because I'm adjusting my limit screws, and then I'm gonna get those lined up before I put in the chain, I can eyeball it and look at my limit screws, both top and bottom. And then I'm going to set up the rear derailleur. To do the top limit screw, or the largest cog, you got to push it over with your hands. Again, it's just a little trick that I've discovered over the years to do this before you put the chain in. Now I'm going to install the cable into the rear derailleur. I'm not going to cut the cable yet until I put the chain on and get the derailleur adjusted. I'm going to go ahead and put my pedals on before I put on the chain. That way I have something to grab onto when I'm adjusting the derailleur and such. Now it's time to install the chain. I'm not going to go into specifics of how to do this, but in general, I go around the front chain ring, around the largest cog in the back, skip the derailleur, add 2 links, and that's where I cut the chain, since this is a brand new chain. So again, just kind of do it so that you have 2 links left, and then I'm going to cut the chain and install it with the power links that it comes with. Now that I've got the chain cut, I'm going to route it through the rear derailleur around the smallest cog, because the derailleur has not been tensioned yet with the cable. Now that I've got the rear derailleur adjusted, I can cut the cable and put on my hose crimp on the end. I've got the shifter cable cut, it's shifting well. I've got the brake cables cut. The last thing that I need to do before I start just doing little tweaks and adjustments is I've got to bleed the brakes, because when you cut the cables, you've got to bleed the brakes. So that's the next step. I'm not going to go into detail of how to do that. I've got a video on my YouTube channel for both Shimano and SRAM brakes of how to bleed the brakes, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to take the wheels back off because I got to make sure I don't get brake fluid on the rotors. So I'm going to take the wheels off, bleed the brakes, and then I'll show you my final things that I do on the bike. The brakes are bled. I just need to center the brakes. I'm going to use this little tool that I put between the rotor and the pads, squeeze the lever, and then tighten the caliper bolts, and that will center up my brakes. Before I put the rear wheel on, I'm going to start putting on my frame saver tape. So I put some back here where my heel can rub. I put some inside the seat stay, because when you slide a rear wheel into a frame, the rotor can actually hit the carbon and it can mess it up. Fortunately, this frame already had a piece of frame saver tape installed. I put some more, and then I put some down inside the bottom part. I will put probably some up at the fork, so where this cable could touch the fork right there. And then any place else where a cable could rub. This bike is pretty good as far as cables. The routing is so good. I don't really have a risk, but I'll probably put just some up at the head tube in case the handlebars turn and the cable could hit the head tube. So any place like my foot could rub or a cable could rub. I also put some underneath the down tube. Now this bike already had frame saver tape underneath the down tube, which is really nice. It also had frame saver tape on the crank arms. I usually put some on the crank arms. And so that way, you know, your heel is going to rub your crank arms at one point, but this one already had frame saver tape on there. So that is almost my final step. Now that I've got the frame saver tape on there, I'm going to put the rear wheel on. And my final step is really just to get the bike set up. So you're adjusting your stem because you can't get that perfectly straight in a work stand. You got to stand over the bike. You're maybe raising the stem up and down. You're getting your brake levers and your shifter exactly where you want them. And then once that's done, if it's a full suspension mountain bike, then you're going to set up your suspension. And I've got a video on my channel of how to do that, rear, front, get that set up. So you're setting up your sag, you're setting up your rebound, your compression, all that. So those are the steps that I go through when I build a bike. You don't have to go in that exact order, but after doing this countless times, I've found that the order that I showed you works best for my workflow. All right, I know this video was kind of long, but building a bike is not a simple process. I will say, just be patient. If you've never done it before, you're gonna run into all kinds of issues. For example, this bike came with 2 risers for brakes. It turns out the front didn't need one. I don't know why it came with 2, but the rear needed one. I didn't have one on the rear, and I ended up having to put one on. I put one on the front and didn't need it. So You're going to run into all kind of little issues when you build a bike, but just be patient, take your time, give yourself, I mean, shoot, 4 or 5 hours the first time you do it, maybe even longer, because there's a lot of steps and you just want to be meticulous. You want to think through everything. So hopefully this video helped you. I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks for watching.